All right, so when I walk into any room that needs to be tiled, the first thing I look at is at the substrate. In this case, we have OSB, ply everywhere, right? So I've already done some of the necessary repairs, but I'm gonna act like I didn't. So when I walk in here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm gonna start taking really hard steps, bouncing on one foot and the other, right? And I'm gonna do that almost over every square foot of this floor. We keep walking around the whole perimeter of this area, right? And you need to put your whole weight on every step, right? I weigh about 200. If you're a little lighter, maybe carry a bag of thin set or something, make yourself a little bit heavier to resemble somebody that's heavy. And then you do the same throughout the whole floor. Feel out the floor for any deflection, which is really the most important thing. If there is any bounce or sagging under load on this floor, that's pretty much a no-go.
And there is an allowable tolerance when it comes to floor deflection. If you look in the 2022 edition TCNA handbook, which every professional tile installer should own a copy of, on page 32 you'll find the equation that you can use to calculate the allowable tolerance of deflection for the certain space which you're tiling, right? But when it comes to small residential jobs like this, you will not sit down and calculate the allowable tolerance. The smartest thing to do would be to eliminate any and all deflection on your substrate. If you even suspect there to be any deflection in between the joist members, cut into the plywood, cut into the OSB, and block in between the joist. Is the only way that you can ensure a proper installation no matter what. Once you've done the necessary repairs in your subfloor to eliminate the perceivable deflection, the next step is to check the flatness of the floor. So pull out your longest level and check how flat the floor is. The TCNA handbook calls for an allowable tolerance of 1/4 inch and 10 feet. That's a pretty tight tolerance. So you need to know how flat your floor is, because anything at or above 1/4 inch needs to be fixed with some self-leveling or patching compound. But at the very least, you know where you might have to compensate during the tile installation. So make sure you know exactly how flat your floor is or isn't before the DTRA gets installed. You might be asking yourself, what is DTRA and why do you recommend it? Why should I use it underneath my tile? Well, it's important you understand what it is and what it does. DTRA is a type of uncoupling membrane, and basically what an uncoupling membrane is a plastic membrane system that's geometrically configured to provide air space between the tile and the substrate to allow independent movement between the two and limit the transfer of stresses and energy, right? Stresses and energy that can crack the tile. There's multiple types of uncoupling membranes. This is the Stratamat from Latticrete, this is the Flexbone from Ardex, and the Red Guard from Custom, right? And they all serve the same basic function, right? So as you can see from this animation that I took from Schluter's website, the substrate, in this case the concrete that's shown underneath the tile, can move independently of the tile above it, right? Without transmitting those cracks upwards into the tile, which normally if a concrete cracks and you have tile over it, the tile is very likely to crack with it. Another very important aspect is on the exterior applications where there's in colder climates, when you have rain that goes through your grout lines and deposits underneath your tile. If it freezes overnight, it of course will expand. The water will expand as it freezes, and the DTRA will allow the expansion without transmitting the energy upwards, thus cracking your grout and your tile. And eventually the water will evaporate. The other most common approved installation method that we find here in North America is the cementitious backer board, a Durarock or Hardy backer, thin setted over plywood for residential applications. This is an approved installation method. You can find it in the 2022 TCNA handbook. But it does not offer the same level of protection as uncoupling membranes do against the transmission of energy. Even if done correctly, it won't protect from the cracking of your grout lines and the cracking of tile. From experience, I tend to see this installation method, even when done correctly, last about from 15 to 25 years before problems start showing up. A trick that you should always do before you install your Deidre is taking care of all the cuts that have to be done so you can slide your tile under the door frame and the casings. I'm the type of installer that likes to have the tile under the door frame, definitely under the casing, but under the door frame, making sure the wood clears the tile so there's no expansion and contraction issues. You should take care of all these cuts everywhere that there's a doorway before you install your Deidre. That way we don't leave, particles of wood all over the Deidre.
When you're cutting the frames and the casings for tile, don't just eyeball it. More than likely it's going to be wrong. This is the way I do it to ensure that more than likely it's going to be almost perfect every single time. So what I do is I take 2 pieces of Deidre, one to symbolize the Deidre that's going on the floor, and the other one to symbolize the thin set. This is only 1/8 of an inch thin set. Especially tiles that are 12 by 24, it's going to be a little bit more than that. So I'll add a little bit on top of that. Then your tile, right? Take the exact same tile that you're installing on the floor, and then you take your pencil and scribe mark it all the way around. Right? Do it. If you're like me, you like to cut the door frame, you go all the way around onto the other side. And that's how you make sure that your cuts for your frames and your casings are done professionally to an exact height, and it's not just a guess. You can eyeball it and do it right sometimes, but not all the time. When you're installing Deidre, always make sure you cut it first. Always make sure it's cut first before you mix any thin set. Before you do anything else, make sure it's cut.
The thin set that we'll be using to install the Deidre today, it's going to be the Schluter's All Set. To install Deidre over plywood, it's required for you to use a modified thin set that meets a certain requirement. You can find the requirements and the standards that your specific thin sets meet somewhere in the bag. At least every thin set should state the ANSI standards that they meet. For Deidre over plywood, you need to use a modified thin set that meets an ANSI standard of A118.11. Now, the reason I use Schluter's All Set is because Schluter's All Set is a very multi-purpose thin set. You can use it, it's a modified thin set, so you can use it to install Deidre over plywood because it meets the standard, and you can also use it to install your tiles over the Deidre, which you can normally not use any other modified thin sets to do that. So, sparing you the details, that's why I recommend Schluter's All Set. So now I'm ready to actually install the Deidre with thin set into the plywood. So I'm going to go ahead and start removing the strips that I already have cut and in place on the floor. I'm going to make a mark along the joint of each strip. That way that mark serves as a guide for the thin set that I'll be applying on the floor. That way I know how much, up to where to apply the thin set for each strip. Now, a very important thing to do before you apply thin set on the floor, especially on plywood, is to wipe down all the plywood with a wet sponge. You need to wipe it down to make sure it's absolutely clean and there's no dust or debris that can stop the thin set from adhering to the plywood, even if you vacuumed it. And also to rehydrate that plywood a little bit, right? You don't want to soak it, but you want to rehydrate it just a tad. That way it doesn't suck the moisture out of the thin set all at once.
So you should use some type of weight to bed the Ditra down into the thin set. As long as the weight you're using does not exceed 75 pounds, you're good to go, right? So I used a box of tile, doesn't quite get to 75 pounds, and now we're gonna check our coverage. So you can see that is excellent coverage. I mean, that is great. Doesn't get better than that. All right, just make sure you're always checking the coverage on your Ditra right after install.
The trowel size that I'm using to bed the Ditra onto the plywood is a 1/4 by 1/4 square notch trowel. Schluter sells a Ditra specific trowel, which is an 11/64 by 11/64 square notch trowel. A 1/4 by 1/4 square notch is bigger, meaning it applies more thin set than an 11/64 by 11/64 square notch. And the reason I like to use a little bit more thin set is because I believe it provides better coverage, and it allows me to overcome those minute imperfections that might be present on your plywood if it's not a brand new sheet of plywood. You shouldn't be trying to overcome big imperfections, right? Those should be fixed. Those are deficiencies. But there's always going to be minor imperfections that a thicker bond coat allows you to overcome much easier.
All right, so I'm gonna guide you through the principle and the methodology I use to acquire a floor tile layout of this kind. So a couple parameters that have to be decided before the installation is, of course, the size of the tile and the offset, whether we're doing half offset like it's shown there, or whether we're doing a 1/3 offset, and I'll put on some pictures so you can visualize that. So in this case, we're doing a half offset. Now, the second thing that you need to decide is what are the focal points in this room. Where we have a freestanding tub on that side, we know that's a focal point, so the customer decided that we want the tile to be centered on that tub. Right afterwards, we have a really nice tiled shower that's gonna go here. So we wanna make sure we don't have many compromises in front of this shower area, right? We want that area to look purposefully made. We don't want nothing to look like a mistake in front of the curb. The third feature is the door, right? The threshold. We don't want to have a very skinny piece of tile against the threshold that it looks like it was a mistake, like it was a miscalculation, right? So we have to take into consideration those three factors specifically. So the first thing we do is we decided on a center. We didn't go with the door as our centered, right? Or with the room centered left or right. We decided to go with a center off the tub. Once that was decided, then I measured, since it's gonna be a half offset, what were my compromises gonna be in front of the tub. In this situation right now, we're gonna have a 21-inch piece and a 9-inch piece, which that is great. It's absolutely acceptable. What we don't want is small pieces. So that works, right? So that means that right off the bat, we can put our 1/2-inch offset tiles on the center, half on the center, full on the center, and we're gonna be good there. We don't have to worry so much about this side because there's gonna be a long vanity going there. Now, what I'm calculating is what piece I'm gonna be left with against the threshold. So to do that, I'm going to mock it going backwards with your spacers. Make sure when you're mocking tile, you use your spacers in your mock-up. You don't wanna do eyeballs because you know your eyes can be crooked. So use your spacers. I'm gonna build it backwards, and I'm gonna build it backwards choosing what my ideal scenario would be. In this case, my ideal scenario would be as a 4-inch threshold. So my ideal scenario, once I put the 4-inch threshold, it will be me cutting about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, right? That's my ideal scenario. That the tile that goes against the threshold only has about 1 inch to 1.5 inches cut. That cut is paramount. You want to cut some of that tile because it allows you to compensate for any off squareness that your layout is against this door. We can't square our whole layout based on this door. I'm using exterior walls to square this line, so that door might be slightly off a square. If you end with a full tile or with a little skinny piece of tile, that growing or shrinking of a piece for the compensating for the square will be very noticeable, right? So I only want to cut about 1 inch, 1.5 inches. That gives me plenty of room to account for any out of squareness. So I'll mock it up and I'll see what piece I have to start with on this side, because obviously I'm gonna work my way out of the room. I won't dare to start working from this side, you know, from the door inwards. That, you know, just seems like a bad idea. Always work your way out of the room, but when you do that, you gotta make sure that you're measured. I don't mind any type of compromise that I have to do on this end because the tub will hide it, and it's a very short run of straight wall. So there's gonna be small cuts in the angles anyways. So I'm willing to do any compromises where they're hidden, but where they're exposed, like here against the curb and against the main door, those are the things you gotta take into account. So in summary, walk into a room, the size of the tile should be decided, the layout interval should be decided. After that, the next thing you need to decide is your center. What are you gonna base your center off of? In this case, it's gonna be a feature in this bathroom, which is the freestanding tub. In another case, it could have been the room itself, right centered on the door, centered on the room. And in other situations, it will be different. Let's say it was a diagonal, right? Then that complicates things. But after your center is decided, right? The next thing to account for is the compromises that center produces in your features. Your features like the nice tile shower that's gonna go there, you don't want compromises in front of that curb. And then the other feature we have here would be the threshold. You don't want compromises in front of that threshold. All right, so I just went ahead and mocked up my tiles with the appropriate spacers, the ones that I'm using during install. And with this tile, I made sure that I placed it at my ideal scenario. This is a 4-inch threshold, it's gonna go from here to here. So I placed this to where I'm only cutting 1.5 inches off this tile. So that being said, all the way down, once I do this, now we know that back here, this is where I'm starting, working my way outwards, we need, with some space against the drywall, we need about a 6-inch tile, right? So that's how you mock up your tiles to ensure that your layout always ends up accurately at a focal point, like the entrance of a room.
Let's talk about the rules that you should follow whenever you are troweling or installing tiles on floors or walls. The first rule that I like to discuss is the spacing that you need to have along the perimeter of your floor, right? So you should always have at least 1/8 of an inch. In my opinion, 1/4 of an inch is more adequate, but at least 1/8 of an inch gap between the tile and the drywall or whatever material is on the wall. That should always serve as an expansion joint. Your tile should never ever be tight against the drywall. That's just a recipe for failure, because if that wall or the stud members in the wall decide to expand, it would load the floor under pressure, and if that happens enough or to a certain degree from multiple sides, your tiles can start cracking. So that's very paramount that you have a spacing of at least 1/8 of an inch. In my opinion, 1/4 inch is more adequate along the whole perimeter of the installation. The second rule that's paramount to follow during an installation like this one is your trowel size. The size of trowel you use can be the difference between success and failure. You use too small of a trowel, you're obviously going to have voids and gaps and air pockets underneath your tiles. It's going to produce a hollow sounding tile, and it can translate into cracking or uncoupling of tiles. That's pretty self-explanatory. You don't want voids underneath your tile. If you choose too large of a trowel size, then you're going to be fighting the installation the whole way through. You're going to have thinset oozing out of the grout lines, an ungodly amount of thinset. That's going to be a pain to clean as you go along, especially if you're using clips, a lippage management system like I'm using here. Do you see those white clips? The removal of those clips are dependent on a clean grout line. So if you use too big of a trowel size, you will have a really hard time removing them, thus needing to cut them, and that can lead to chipping the edges of your tile, because you'll be working on a blade in the grout line to remove the thinset and the leftover plastic. The third rule that is paramount to understand is that when you're troweling over an uncoupling membrane, you need to use the flat side of your trowel, like I'm doing here, to fill all the voids and all the gaps in that uncoupling membrane before you trowel with your square notch side. You need to fill those voids by using the flat notch of your trowel and moving it in multiple directions, in all directions. Don't just move it in one direction, because that won't be enough to fill all the voids. And only then, once all the voids are filled with the flat side of your trowel, do you then apply the square notches on the floor. Once you understand these 3 rules and you practice them in a way that you never deviate from them, your installations are almost guaranteed to be a success from the structural point of view, meaning longevity wise, right? Now, when it comes to your ability to produce nice looking and aesthetically pleasing tiles, that's all to do with your ability to be accurate in measuring and transferring that measurement to your tile, and then executing that measurement while cutting all accurately. The tile trades is one of the few industries in which a 1/16 of an inch matters a lot, much more than it would, let's say, on framing or electrical, right? 1/16 of an inch is very noticeable in tile work, especially when you're using high contrast grout.
And the sides?
So once your layout is planned intelligently and it's decided beforehand, and you've taken into account all the variables, And once you understand those 3 basic principles and rules that we spoke about when it comes to laying the tile, the next most important thing is checking your coverage. So here you can see that I lifted a tile up to check the coverage. What that means is that you're going to lift the tile up after you've already installed it. When you do, you should feel a ton of resistance, kinda similar to what you would feel if you were trying to remove a good suction cup from a piece of glass, of smooth glass. It should have a ton of resistance. And once you overcome the resistance and you're able to lift the tile up, you should see that there is no air pockets and no trowel marks left over underneath that tile. It should just look like little small peaks and valleys everywhere, but no discernible trowel marks or air pockets. You should check the coverage of one of the tiles on every row or every other row at the very least to ensure that you're applying those basic principles of troweling correctly. If you do spot on one of the checks some air pockets or deficiencies in the coverage, you have to immediately reassess. Not only fix that one tile, but understand what behavior or practice is causing this problem during your troweling process. So now we're reaching the end of the installation. We're right up against the threshold on the entryway. So this is a very important focal point because this is what most people are going to look at as soon as they walk into the bathroom or the room. So just make sure that the cuts that go up against the threshold are perfectly measured, that they're the same size, that they have the same size grout line against the threshold, and you should be all right. Now we begin the preparation for the grouting process. So as you can see, right now I am going through every grout line and cleaning it and vacuuming it at the same time, freeing it from any residue of thinset that may have been left from the installation on the grout lines. Now we start grouting. Grouting, the most important advice I can give is follow the manufacturer's recommendation when it comes to mixing and applying the grout. You try to apply it while holding the float at a diagonal angle in relation to the grout lines. That way, as you fill the grout line, the edge of the float does not dig out grout, and you maintain a filled grout joint. And you go along and you do this hopefully in a way where you have enough time before all the grout in your bucket dries. Some grouts cure faster than others, so make sure you mix accordingly. Once you have the whole floor grouted, the next step will be to go over everything with water and a sponge. You're going to remove all the sediment and residue from grout on the surface of the floor, and you will be smoothing the grout lines at the same time, giving the grout lines their final form. Once you've done this one time over the whole floor, you will do it again. So you will do 2 passes of water with a sponge over the whole floor, the whole surface of the floor. The second pass is more for that residue that's left on top. And then after you've done that twice with multiple buckets of clean water, you will grab a dry microfiber rag. This is what I like to do, and I will go over the floor twice with microfiber rags, and then it should be finished. So we've come to the end of the video. I hope that you were able to gather some value out of this. Of course, there is many more details that I could get into, but it wouldn't be conducive to a watchable video. So the only thing I ask is, as a gentleman's agreement, if you've gathered any value at all from this video, subscribe to the channel, give us a like. This takes a considerable amount of effort and time to record and produce these videos, and I'll do it all by myself. So as a gentleman's agreement, if you've gathered any value at all, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll try to keep producing the best content I can to share my obsession with tile work that will last a lifetime.